A young waitress was working at a gala event when a socialite decided to use her to put on a spectacle. In an attempt to humiliate her, the socialite inadvertently created an entirely different kind of show at the heart of British high society. Windermere Castle gleamed in the cold London night, an imposing monolith against the fog that swallowed the surrounding streets. The windows of the grand hall spilled golden light, reflecting off the frost-covered lawn. Inside, the aristocrats and magnates of Britain's elite drank and laughed, surrounded by crystal chandeliers and historic furnishings that carried centuries of stories and privilege. Clara Worthington carefully carried her tray as she moved through the conversations. Her black uniform was immaculate, though far from comfortable. This was her third time working at Windermere Castle as a waitress for gala events, yet she never grew accustomed to the weight of its atmosphere. Every glance cast her way, whether distracted or condescending, was a reminder that she didn't belong there. She stopped near the fireplace, balancing glasses of wine while discreetly observing the guests. It wasn't envy she felt, but a kind of anthropological fascination. They spoke with rehearsed enthusiasm, smiling with perfect teeth, yet there was always something hollow in their words, as if they were mere ornaments. "You seem uncomfortable by the fire, too warm." The voice was deep and calm, breaking subtly through the orchestrated sounds around her. Clara turned to see a man in a perfectly tailored black suit, his slightly tousled hair contrasting with his polished presence. He had the look of someone who belonged anywhere but preferred to observe from a distance. "No, sir," Clara replied, quickly straightening her posture. "Just waiting for someone to take the glasses before they go warm." "Practical, but you don't seem like someone who only focuses on what's in front of them." He tilted his head, intrigued. "Waitresses don't usually analyze entire rooms. You were studying something." Clara pressed her lips together, unsure how to respond. What was it in his eyes? It wasn't disdain or irony. Curiosity, perhaps. "Economics and international relations," she answered almost reflexively, as if it were more a part of her identity than something she needed to hide. He raised his eyebrows. "Sorry, what?" "I study that," Clara said, adjusting the tray in her hands. "Economics and international relations. And yes, I was studying the room. Old habit." The man smiled, less practiced than the others around her, infinitely more genuine. "Old habit? Where does that come from exactly?" "Observation. I grew up in Suffolk. You learn quickly to read people, to know who to trust and who to avoid. Later, at university, it became something more academic. Southwark to economics and international relations," he repeated with subtle admiration. "That explains a lot." "And you, sir?" Clara asked, more as a cautious provocation than out of genuine interest. He gave a short laugh. "Henry Blackwood, founder of Blackwood Systems. Not that it means much here. Nearly everyone in this room has some title or company to sustain their hollow conversations." Clara gave him a faint smile, but didn't reply. He seemed different, but that didn't mean he was trustworthy. It was the kind of distinction she preferred not to test. "Henry, darling," the sharp voice of Lady Margaret Lancaster cut through the room before Clara could process more. The hostess, tall and impeccably dressed in dark green silk, approached with a calculated smile. Her eyes quickly scanned Clara, assessing her as though she were a blemish on the scenery. "You always find the most interesting corners, don't you?" Margaret said, flashing a smile at Henry before turning to Clara. "And you, my dear, seem remarkably articulate for someone in this role." Clara kept her expression impassive, but felt the weight of Margaret's tone. The woman carried the kind of charisma that intimidated effortlessly. "Thank you, madam," Clara replied, refusing to waver. "Interesting indeed," Margaret continued, turning back to Henry. "Of all the people here, you chose to talk to someone outside our circle. Perhaps because she has something more interesting to say. Henry replied smoothly, though there was a sharpness to his tone, like a concealed blade. Margaret narrowed her eyes but kept her smile intact. Oh, undoubtedly. In fact, Clara, is it Clara? I'm sure a mind like yours loves a challenge. Clara nodded, knowing she was about to be tested. Margaret was the kind of person who never delivered a blow without following it with another. Let's see, Margaret began, a malicious glint in her eye. Suppose the United Kingdom wanted to strike a trade deal with an emerging country, but that country's primary export conflicts with domestic production here. How would you resolve that situation? The room began to quiet. It wasn't common to see Margaret address the staff directly, let alone challenge them. Clara could feel the weight of their gazes, some curious, others waiting for her to falter. She took a deep breath. It would depend on the nature of the conflict. If it were agricultural, for example, the UK could consider temporary subsidies to protect domestic producers while facilitating the entry of foreign goods. But for that to work, it would need to ensure the impact on inflation doesn't undermine the larger goal of the agreement. A pause. Some whispers. Clara kept her chin high, refusing to appear intimidated. Margaret smiled with her lips, but not her eyes. Interesting, but mathematics is the foundation of everything, isn't it? Let's try something simpler. How long does it take for a 120-meter train to cross an 80-meter bridge at 60 kilometers per hour? Clara held the tray steady, calculating quickly. 12 seconds, she replied without hesitation. The room froze for a moment. Henry's smile flickered, faint but pleased, while Margaret tilted her head, feigning approval. You're full of surprises, Margaret said, her smile as false as the polite applause that followed. But Clara knew. The game had just begun. The room felt like a stage set for an unplanned spectacle, and Clara was the improvised star. She knew it. The gazes fixed on her were full of something oscillating between amusement and scorn. But she also understood that, for Lady Margaret Lancaster, this wasn't just a game, it was a battle for control. Margaret relished making people feel small. Clara had worked enough high-profile events to recognize the kind of person who masked their insecurities with a facade of superiority. What irritated her most, however, was Margaret's efficiency in doing so, and the clear pleasure she seemed to derive from it. So, Clara, Margaret began, her tone sweet with a sharp undercurrent. Since you enjoy analyzing economic matters, let's see how you handle something a little more technical. Margaret gestured to an older guest. He wore round glasses and had the air of a retired professor who was acutely aware of his own intellect. Lord Thomas Grant, Clara recognized, a specialist in political history and a close friend of the Lancaster family. You don't mind, do you, Thomas? Help us with a question. He nodded, turning to Clara with an expression more curious than hostile. Still, Clara knew she was about to be tested, and the audience was eager for her to fail. If the United Kingdom, in a post-Brexit context, were to renegotiate a series of treaties with the European Union, what would you say is the greatest challenge in maintaining global market competitiveness? Clara felt the weight of the question. It was broad, political, and laced with nuances designed to make someone stumble over assumptions. But she took a deep breath, organizing her thoughts. It would be the regulation of standards, she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. The UK would have to balance economic independence with the necessity of maintaining standards equivalent to those of the EU. If those standards were relaxed to attract investors, it could alienate international markets that trust in British quality. On the other hand, adhering to strict regulations could stifle smaller sectors that rely on competitiveness. Grant raised his eyebrows. A well-reasoned answer, he said with a slight nod, though it's a dilemma without an easy solution. Clara knew this was the closest thing to praise she would get. Still, the admiration on a few of the guests' faces was hard to ignore, as was the flicker of doubt in Margaret's eyes. "Interesting," Margaret interrupted. "But economics is just a tool. What about culture? Clara, would you say you have a solid cultural foundation?" Clara pressed her lips together, knowing exactly where this was headed. "Why don't we try something more classical?" Margaret continued, smiling as if she'd just had a brilliant idea. "How about literature?" One of the guests murmured something about them being too hard on the girl, but Margaret ignored it. "Thomas, please." "Something appropriate," Margaret said. Thomas adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "Very well. In the context of Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, how would you interpret the relationship between Elizabeth Bennet and Darcy in social terms?" Clara paused for a moment. The question was complex and clearly designed to corner her. "Their relationship," Clara began, "is essentially a struggle between personal pride and the constraints imposed by a rigidly hierarchical society. Darcy represents the privilege of the aristocracy, while Elizabeth challenges the status quo through her intelligence and character. However, the most interesting part is that both have to deconstruct their own perceptions of value, Darcy learning to respect someone outside his social sphere, and Elizabeth recognizing that her first impressions were based on prejudices as deep as Darcy's." Thomas smiled. Not a patronizing smile, but something closer to genuine approval. "Very good. Few analyze it with such clarity." Margaret, however, was unimpressed, or at least pretended not to be. She crossed her arms, leaning toward Clara. "You're full of surprises, Clara. But let's test something more practical, shall we? Art, perhaps." Clara began to respond, but was interrupted by Henry Blackwood, who finally decided to step in. He moved closer, his tone calm, but filled with authority. "Margaret," he said, "don't you think you've done enough? Clara has answered your questions impeccably." Margaret smiled, but it was a hollow smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, Henry, it's all in good fun. Clara's handling it just fine. Isn't that right, dear?" Clara lifted her chin. "I am, madam." Henry looked at Clara, studying her for a moment before speaking again. "In any case, Margaret, perhaps it's time to stop proving what we already know. Clara has more capability than most people in this room." The silence that followed was heavy. Margaret didn't reply immediately, but her eyes gleamed with a mixture of frustration and something close to fury. "Well," she said at last, "if you insist, but I think we can all agree Clara has surprised us. What luck we have to witness such a sharp mind, serving champagne." She spun on her heel and walked away, the conversation ending as abruptly as it had begun. Clara stood still, holding the tray firmly in her hands. She knew she had won that round, but the real battle wasn't over yet. Margaret wasn't the type to give up easily, and Clara, for the first time that evening, realized neither was she. The tension in the hall was palpable. Margaret Lancaster remained silent, while the guests exchanged furtive glances. Some smiled, clearly entertained by the way Clara had handled the challenges. Others, including Margaret, displayed evident discomfort. But Margaret was not a woman who let a defeat pass without retaliation. She took a deep breath, composing herself, and her voice cut through the murmurs like a blade. "Well, Clara, you are without question impressive. But let's see if that sharp mind of yours handles something more practical. How about a modern problem? Something from the real world?" Clara kept her chin raised. By now, it came as no surprise that Margaret would not give up. "Imagine this," Margaret began, assuming the condescending tone of a professor. "A government facing a fiscal deficit crisis decides to raise taxes on essential goods. Inflation spikes and social unrest grows. What would you recommend as a strategy to balance revenue while avoiding political instability? The guests turned to Clara. The question was complex, involving economics, politics, and a touch of provocation. Clara knew Margaret was trying to paint her as someone who, despite her intelligence, couldn't grasp the challenges of the real world. Clara paused for a moment, analyzing the elements of the problem before responding. First, I wouldn't raise taxes on essential goods, such as food and energy. Those increases disproportionately affect low-income populations and worsen inequality. Instead, I would redirect taxes toward luxury goods and implement tax cuts for sectors that stimulate economic growth, such as small businesses. She paused, aware that everyone was listening intently. As for inflation, the solution can't be fiscal alone. Coordination with the central bank would be necessary, adjusting monetary policy to stabilize the currency while negotiating with trade partners to mitigate the impact of inflationary imports. And above all, I would involve civil society in the process to ensure that people understand the rationale behind the measures and feel included in the solution. The hall fell silent for a moment before erupting into murmurs. Some guests nodded in approval. Others, visibly uncomfortable with their inability to follow her reasoning, looked away. Margaret smiled, but it was a cold smile, hiding venom ready to be unleashed. Very well, Clara, an almost brilliant answer. Almost. But you know what they say about people who live in theories. They never understand what it's like to deal with reality. Clara maintained her composure, but she knew what was coming. You speak very well for someone who likely grew up in some dreary neighborhood with damp-stained walls, Margaret continued, her voice now lower but dripping with venom. And tell me, was it your mother or your father who thought it would be a good idea to invest in economics? I mean, it certainly wasn't the person who chose your haircut. A muffled laugh escaped from a corner of the room, and Clara felt heat rise to her face. She saw a few people avert their eyes, clearly embarrassed by Margaret's tone, but no one intervened. Clara took a deep breath. Letting herself be affected was exactly what Margaret wanted. She lifted her eyes and locked them directly onto Margaret's. "Excuse me, madam," Clara said, her voice clear and controlled. "I understand that my haircut may not be to your liking, but it was the most practical choice for a woman who works and studies full-time." She paused, letting the weight of her words hang in the air before continuing. "And yes, I grew up in Southwark in a small apartment, but you see, that taught me something that perhaps not everyone in this room understands. Value, the value of effort, the value of respect, and the value of never underestimating anyone." The hall fell into absolute silence. Even the muffled laughter transformed into shocked, perhaps slightly admiring looks. Margaret opened her mouth, but no words came out. She hadn't expected Clara to respond so incisively, yet so respectfully. For a brief moment, her face was filled with hostility, but it quickly morphed into an expression of icy calm. "What an inspiring speech," Margaret said flatly. "Too bad inspiration doesn't pay the bills." "That's true," Clara replied, tilting her head with a faint smile. "But inspiration is what drives those who have bills to pay to find better ways to live. And that's what truly matters." This time, the silence that followed was almost deafening. A few guests began clapping hesitantly, but Henry Blackwood was the first to step forward. "Brilliant," he said, looking at Clara with a genuine smile. "Margaret, if I were you, I'd be careful about underestimating minds like hers. They tend to make history." Margaret remained still, but her face betrayed a mix of anger and humiliation. Clara knew this wasn't over, but for now, she felt triumphant. She returned to her work, the tray steady in her hands, knowing that with every answer, she became a little harder to ignore. Clara Worthington walked through the grand hall of Windermere Castle, balancing a tray in one hand. The golden light of the chandeliers cascaded down on her, highlighting the champagne glasses that sparkled like tiny liquid jewels. Her steps were careful, calculated, but her mind still echoed with Lady Margaret's sharp words. The uncomfortable silence that had fallen over the room after her responses now felt like an invisible presence, a shadow lingering above her. She stopped near a small group of guests and, with a polite smile, held out the tray. A man took a glass, followed by a woman. Everything was under control, until someone called her from behind. "Hey girl, another one over here." The abrupt motion as she turned, combined with the unbalanced weight of the tray, proved fatal. Before Clara could register her mistake, one of the glasses tipped over the edge, followed by another, and in an instant, the golden liquid was flying through the air. The champagne landed squarely on the cream-colored dress of an elegant woman and dripped onto the perfectly polished shoe of the man beside her. The tray, now off-kilter, hit a nearby table, sending a small floral arrangement toppling over. For a moment, Clara stood frozen in shock. The room, which had been alive with muffled conversations and quiet laughter, fell into an awkward silence. "Well, of course," came Lady Margaret's voice, sharp as shattered glass. "Hardly surprising, is it? No matter how well she speaks, in the end, she'll always be exactly this, a clumsy mess." Clara swallowed hard, lowering herself to gather the fallen glasses. Her hands trembled as she tried to compose herself. "Perhaps champagne is simply too sophisticated for someone used to serving tea in mugs back in Suffolk," Margaret continued, her voice dripping with sarcastic amusement. "Or maybe the problem is something else. Perhaps it's hard to focus when you're so desperate to impress people who will never accept you." The murmurs among the guests began again, low and charged with tension. Clara felt her cheeks burn, but she couldn't find the words to defend herself. She wanted to say something, anything, but her throat felt too tight. Margaret wasn't finished. Now that she had the room's full attention, she seemed determined to see her attack through to the end. "And look at that hair," she said, gesturing toward Clara. "If only you'd spent part of your education money on something decent for your appearance. Maybe, just maybe, people here might take you seriously." A low chuckle came from one corner of the room, but it was abruptly silenced by another voice. A voice that cut through the tension with unyielding authority. "That's enough, Margaret." Everyone turned to see Sir Edwin Hayes, standing with his arms crossed and his gaze fixed on Margaret. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with neatly combed grey hair and an air of quiet authority that commanded attention. Margaret turned slowly to face him, the smile still plastered on her face, though it was clear she was rattled by the interruption. "Edwin," she began, her tone almost defensive, "I was merely trying to teach a lesson." "A lesson?" Edwin repeated, stepping forward. "Because that's what you think this is, isn't it? Teaching a lesson. But do you know what I see? A petty attempt to humiliate a young woman who, unlike many here, had to fight to get where she is." The room grew even heavier with silence. Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but Edwin didn't give her the chance. "You want to talk about education and appearance? Fine, let's talk about them. Clara just demonstrated in this very room that she possesses an intelligence and a level of reasoning that surpasses half the people here, including myself. And do you know what's even more remarkable? She did it while maintaining her composure, despite being constantly provoked." He gestured to the guests around them. "And the rest of us stood here, watching you attack this young woman as if it was some kind of sport. It's disgraceful." Clara, still kneeling as she picked up the broken glasses, glanced up at Edwin. There was something in the way he spoke, his tone filled with respect and righteous indignation, that almost brought tears to her eyes. Edwin turned back to Margaret. "And as for you, Margaret, perhaps it's time to reevaluate what sophistication truly means. Because if you ask me, class has nothing to do with money or lineage. Class is about how we treat others, especially those like Clara, who are trying to rise in a world determined to hold them down. The room was utterly still. Margaret looked around, realizing that many of the guests were now regarding her with discomfort, if not outright disapproval. "Well," she said finally, collecting herself, "you're entitled to your opinion, Edwin, and you have the choice to change," he replied calmly. Margaret cast one last glance at Clara before turning on her heel, her footsteps echoing sharply against the marble floor as she walked away. Edwin approached Clara, who was now standing, the broken glass balanced on her tray. "Clara," he said, his voice softer now, "don't let this define you. You are so much more than this." Clara took a deep breath, feeling a strange mix of relief and gratitude. "Thank you, sir," she said sincerely. Edwin gave her a faint smile. "You don't need to thank me. The credit is entirely yours." And with that, he turned back to the other guests, leaving Clara with an unexpected feeling. For the first time that evening, someone truly saw her. After the confrontation between Sir Edwin and Lady Margaret, the hall seemed enveloped in a reflective silence. The guests, who had been either complicit or passive moments ago, began whispering among themselves. The focus had shifted. Clara Worthington, who until minutes earlier had been seen merely as the waitress, now seemed different. She was no longer just a young woman working to get by. She was someone who had endured humiliation with dignity and demonstrated an intelligence that could no longer be ignored. Still holding the tray with shards of glass, Clara discreetly stepped away, trying to find a place to clean up the mess. Her thoughts were scattered, and the emotional weight of what had just happened felt heavy on her chest. She wanted to disappear, but she could still feel the gazes on her, not mocking now, but something softer. "We can't let her leave like this." The sentence came from a nearby table, spoken by a middle-aged woman in an elegant gown, her eyes kind. Lady Eleanor Cavendish was known for her generosity, but she rarely made public declarations. "She has a rare intelligence," Lady Eleanor continued, turning to those around her. "Don't you think? What we saw today wasn't just someone answering difficult questions. It was someone facing immense pressure with grace and precision." "I agree," said Lord James Althorpe, a retired lawyer and former Oxford professor. "I've taught for decades, and I can tell you that many of my best students would have faltered under the kind of pressure Clara faced. That's not common." Another guest, a young entrepreneur named Arthur Wells, interjected. "What impressed me most was her courage. How many of us in her position could have endured all that without losing composure or retaliating poorly?" Eleanor listed courage, intelligence, dedication. "This young woman has everything she needs to go far, except one thing: opportunity." The murmurs grew louder. People at several tables began discussing the situation, some trying to recall the last time they had witnessed something similar, others commenting on how admirably Clara had handled Lady Margaret. "Well then, why don't we do something about it?" Arthur asked, looking directly at Eleanor. "Do what?" asked Lord Althorpe. "Fund her studies," Arthur replied simply. "She mentioned she studies economics and international relations, right? We can ensure she has the resources she needs to complete her education and perhaps go even further." Eleanor smiled. "That sounds like an excellent idea. I'd be happy to contribute myself." "So would I," Althorpe said, leaning forward. "Oxford would be thrilled to have her, and I'd be more than willing to ensure she gets the support she needs." Others began nodding, one after another. The idea of supporting Clara wasn't just an act of generosity, it was also a way to reaffirm something that seemed lost in that hall of privilege, the recognition of true merit. Sir Edwin, who had remained silent until then, approached the group, listening to the conversation. "Then that's what we'll do," he said with a faint smile. And it won't be just a donation. Clara needs to understand that what happened today was a turning point, not just because of her intelligence, but because of her effort, her resilience, and her ability to remain true to herself. "We need to speak to her," Eleanor said. Edwin nodded. "I'll handle it." He crossed the hall to where Clara stood, now near the kitchen, trying to clean the tray. When he approached, she lifted her eyes, wary but exhausted. "Clara," Edwin said, his voice calm, "come with me. There's something you need to hear." She hesitated, but something in his tone compelled her to follow. When they returned to the main hall, the murmurs stopped. Clara realized that all eyes were on her again, but this time there was something different, a mix of respect and curiosity. Edwin stopped at the center of the hall, next to Clara, and glanced around before speaking. "This young woman has proven, beyond question, that she possesses extraordinary intelligence and character. What she lacks is not merit, but opportunity. And as many of you have agreed, that's something we can provide." He turned to Clara. "Clara, the guests here have decided that your effort and dedication deserve to be rewarded. They will fund your studies, ensuring that you can focus on reaching your full potential." Clara blinked, confused, almost unable to process what was happening. What? No, I can't accept this." "Yes, you can," Eleanor said, standing and walking toward her. "You've proven yourself capable, Clara, and do you know what else? We want to do this. This isn't charity, it's an investment. One day you'll do something extraordinary with this, and all of us will be proud to have played a part in your journey." Clara felt her eyes burn, but she forced herself not to cry. She looked around, seeing faces that had once seemed cold and distant now filled with warmth. I don't know how to thank you," she said finally, her voice trembling. "You don't need to," Edwin replied, smiling. "Just keep being exactly who you are." The hall erupted into applause, and for the first time that night, Clara felt she wasn't invisible. This was her chance, and she wasn't going to waste it. The hall was still filled with murmurs when Sir Edwin turned back to Clara. His expression carried genuine respect, something rare in a place where appearances usually held more value than people. "Clara," he began, his voice warm, "you've proven something today that goes far beyond intelligence. You've shown strength, integrity, and character. The guests here have agreed to help you achieve what you deserve. This isn't a debt, nor is it charity. It's a bet on your future." The others nodded, including Lady Eleanor and Lord Althorp, who smiled encouragingly. "So for tonight, go home," Edwin continued. "Rest. You've been through enough. You're free to leave." Clara looked at him, then at the others, feeling the weight of the moment. A hush fell over the room, as if everyone was waiting for her response. She could feel the emotions swirling within her, gratitude, relief, exhaustion. But there was something stronger, something that had guided her from the moment she'd stepped into that castle. Her commitment to the work she had agreed to do. "Mr. Hayes," she began, her voice clear and steady, "I'm deeply grateful for everything that's been offered to me today. It's an opportunity that will change my life, and I'll never be able to repay it enough. But..." She took a deep breath, her gaze unwavering, but free of arrogance. "I will finish my shift as agreed. I was hired to work tonight, and I'm being paid for it. Treating everyone equally and acting with professionalism is part of who I am. Receiving this opportunity doesn't change what is right." The hall fell silent. There were no more murmurs, only the faint crackling of the fire in the hearth and the soft clinking of crystal at the tables. Slowly, Sir Edwin smiled, not the practiced smile so common in that room, but something genuine. "Clara," he said, with a tone that seemed to carry the weight of the entire room's approval, "you are extraordinary." "Extraordinary indeed," echoed Lady Eleanor, visibly moved. A few guests began clapping, hesitantly at first, but soon the applause spread. It wasn't the formal applause Clara had heard throughout the evening, but something deeper, more visceral, more human. It was a celebration of her, not as a character in a staged scene, but as the person she truly was. Clara bowed her head briefly, allowing herself a small smile. Then she returned to her work. The tray was refilled with glasses, and she resumed her path through the hall, serving the guests who now regarded her in an entirely different light. As the night came to an end and the hall began to empty, Sir Edwin, Lady Eleanor, and a few others approached Clara once more. "Clara," said Eleanor, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder, "today you reminded us that character cannot be bought. It is built. Thank you for showing us that." Clara simply smiled. "I only did what anyone should, madam." Eleanor shook her hand warmly. "No, dear, you did so much more. And now go home, because starting tomorrow, your life begins to change." Clara left the castle that night in her simple uniform, her heart feeling lighter. The cold London wind no longer seemed so cutting. As she walked through the empty streets, the city lights reflecting in the puddles of rain, she felt something she had never felt before. Not just hope, but certainty. Her intelligence, effort, and dedication had opened a door. But what would truly sustain her was something deeper. Her integrity and her belief that no matter where she stood, she would always remain true to herself. And as Windermere Castle faded into the distance, Clara knew that this night was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of everything. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to the channel. We need your support.
Better stories are yet to come.